Hi, sorry about that. Good evening. My name is Winnie Yan, and I'm the head of heritage of Taikoo. Very welcome to the third Taikoo Conversations, a very new talk series that we have for the heritage offerings of Taikoo. This is a continuous effort to try to bring heritage conservation and also cultural discussions to the general public as well. Aside from all the many different kinds of exhibitions and programs that we have, this is a new approach that we want to invite people from Hong Kong and overseas to talk about specific topics on heritage conservations. We do have speakers every time, but we do encourage, that's why we call it conversation. We do want to encourage you to converse as well. So before I introduce the speaker, I just want to get you to understand a little more about what we're trying to do here. Now, what Claudia just put up right now is we're trying to do a live poll during the entire program, where you can actually scan the QR code on your far left right there, and you can actually vote a very simple question. Do you feel connected to local heritage? And that's something that you can actually carry on to provide us with data for the entire duration of it. I think what we're hoping to do is, particularly after our speaker's speech, that you can actually ask questions and engage with her and to have a conversation with her. I'll just introduce Gesa really quickly. Gesa Schwantes is a good friend of Taikoo, obviously, because she's actually, if you look at the conservation of Taikoo, one of the most important things, one of the principal guidelines that we have, is to try to uphold the authenticity of the historic buildings. Gesa, who is the director of AC Labs from University of Hong Kong, she actually helped us at the beginning in terms of doing paint analysis on many of the facades of our building, which actually contributed to the results of what you see today. Fundamentally, we want to revert the building back to its original appearances, and that has a lot to do with what Gesa has done at the earlier time, where we're actually conserving all these buildings and turn this into Taikoo. Wow, 1%. Well, I'm wasting time here, so without further ado, I'll just invite Gesa Schwantes to come and give us.
Okay. Hello, good evening. Thank you for introducing me, Winnie. I just told Winnie I find it's a little bit of a historic moment itself, because Winnie and I know each other for almost 10 years now. That's how long I am here. And she is now here head of heritage, and I'm now here head of the Architectural Conservation Lab. And when we met each other, we were just classmates in Hong Kong U. So I think this is a nice moment for us too, and feels very at home and family here. I'm just gonna start with my talk. I hope, because of this setup, that I don't keep talking like this, but keep talking like this, because sometimes I want to show you things on the slides. So I hope I remember. Also, maybe Claudia can remind me if I talk too fast, because Chris told me not to talk too fast for the interpretation. I'm talking tonight about, first, what are architectural finishes. Basically, everybody of you could answer that question somehow, but I want to remind you to warm up what that includes. Why do we investigate architectural finishes? And then how do we do this? And at the how question, I change from general examples to this site. So in the beginning, I talk about the topic in a little bit more general, and then at the second part of the talk, I give more examples from this site, and then in the end conclude with how is the information that we find out with analysis actually used in the conservation intervention. In conservation, we professionally separate decorated and non-decorated architecture finishes. In terms of conserving them, there are differences, so I also introduce a couple of decorated and undecorated finishes first to make you understand that if you're not so familiar with finishes. I was told I should make this talk as general as possible and not too technical, but you all know in your own field, I don't feel I'm very technical. So I'm sorry if it sometimes still gets too specific. I try to make it more generally understandable. I show you these two and the next example of decorated finishes. Already when you see these three examples, you see different materials used. A lime paint decoration here, and this is, I actually don't know because it's only a tourist photo, but I expect this to be probably silicate paint or also lime paint. And then this is paint bound with animal glue and plant saps. So this is for you just a colorful wall paintings. I already think about what kind of different materials could be made of. Decorated architectural finishes are not only paint, they can also be decorated plasters, plaster relief. Sometimes they are also painted colorful. If you want to know more about these pictures later, you can ask later in the question answer. I took almost all, I think all the pictures in this presentation myself, so I have to something to talk about every picture if there's something that interests you especially. Undecorated architectural finishes. So tonight, especially when I think about what I focus this talk on, this site, I would call all of these mostly undecorated architectural finishes. That is basically just plaster and paint finishes that cover building facades or building parts. And when we think about that, all finishes, if it's decorated or non-decorated, also serve the purpose of covering the substrate, and with that, preserving the substrate from weathering, protecting the substrate. When I say substrate in this context, I mean the wall, the brick wall underneath the plaster underneath the paint, whatever the finish is painted on, we call that the substrate. So when we think about how do these finishes protect the substrate, it may be the varnish, like we saw here in the example of the temple. You see what happens if you don't maintain a finish on a wooden beam or a wooden column. Then you get weathered wood. If that finish would have been maintained over and over, then the wood doesn't decay. So the wood finish here, A, is a decoration because it was red columns, but it also serves to protect the wood. I gave the three main examples of what kind of finishes a varnish or a paint on a wood, plaster on a facade. You have a very general example here. Once we have no plaster anymore, the bricks are exposed. We also have fair-faced brick walls, so bricks are not necessarily directly attacked, but still the plaster, if it's maintained, protects the building. You see here sort of a little bit decorated, but mostly undecorated houses in Guangdong province, very similar one in Penang. You see me here investigating the plaster decoration, which we here only investigated what kind of finishes were used, what kind of yellow finishes, what kind of materials were used to paint these buildings, and the majority, the function of these finishes is A, decoration, but B, also protecting the buildings. And then especially important when a lime finish covers a clay structure. In this first example is a adobe wall in Yunnan province. You see already where the lime finish deteriorated or fell off. You see the adobe bricks running down there. Adobe is sun-dried earth blocks. So they are only physically dried, and it's not a chemical process for them to cure or to dry. So once running water touches the surface, they start to run down. So here the lime is more weathering resistant, covers the adobe wall. And same for here. You see the clay wall underneath. This is plaster with a lot of, still not a good position. I'm moving around a little bit. Sorry, Winnie. Is it okay? I cannot see the screen of the computer, and I still want to sort of see where I'm in the talk. Okay, sorry. So here you see a straw and a clay plaster. There's most probably some kind of wood construction underneath. Then they apply clay plaster, and then in the top finish, it's a lime finish, which is then painted with red paint. So here the finish has a decorative function of a unique color. So there's a meaning for that to be red. It was red since the building was built. It's the oldest Buddhist structure in China, at least the wood structure, I was told. And so if we repaint or replaster a finish like this may not be the original plaster from, sorry that I didn't note when this building was built, probably 10th or 11th century. But it was replastered, and with that, the structure was also restored. So sometimes replastering and repainting of a material with new materials is okay, is conservation, because we preserve the building itself. An example, this is actually the study site of my PhD thesis. This site, I would say usually if you restore a building like this, a facade like this, you would replaster. You look at what kind of materials are used, local clay plaster with fibers in it, and a lime finish. And if a plaster in big parts is missing on a facade like this, you would replaster it using the traditional materials. In this case, however, because of this graffiti from Cultural Revolution, this is part of the history of the building. So the finish gained another significance with these graffiti. So the restoration intervention also changed with that, because we now preserve a different heritage value. So that what he did then is grouting the historic materials. So here the original fabric is actually preserved. The delaminated plaster is reattached, and you see these infills here were made only to keep those parts that are still hold the graffiti. So I sort of want to explain to you what I gave in the example before, that in order to understand what kind of intervention is the correct intervention, or what is the suitable and sustainable conservation for a certain heritage resource, we have to think about the cultural heritage values or cultural significance of a site, or of a building part, or of an architectural finish. And these relate to the historical context, the integrity of the building or the site or the finish, the authenticity, which I go into detail a little bit more with these terms too, or I give examples for what I mean in this context with these terms. And I also give a little bit more information on this slide. When you look at this with your experience, maybe more, I don't know, all the backgrounds of the audience, but you would think, oh, this is a super newly painted blue house, and this is a super newly painted turquoise house. For me, I think, look at these sites. This one is sort of wrong, and this, because I know the history of the building, I can accept this finish, even though it's still sort of strange. I talk about this, the Blue House later. The Hong Kong people in the audience know this building. This building in Penang has a lot of problems with renovation, with latex finishes in all kind of colors. The conservation architect I worked with in Georgetown is constantly in tears because he went home another day and another building was painted in pink. And then it's not really about the color. This building is not that bad than this building because different materials were used. I talk about that also in another slide. So here I talk a little bit more about what is integrity. Integrity can be preserving an architecture style or integrity of existing materials or a completeness or of an architecture design. So you can think about integrity and authenticity in different level. They gain different meaning in the process or in the conservation process in different examples that I bring here. This is the central government offices in Icehouse Street in Central. And here we did investigation of the facade. There was this is actually a new picture. This is after the restoration. We had an historic picture from about the same area, and we knew that it was originally painted, or not painted, but colorful design. And we investigated the surfaces and found out that almost all of these areas are still existing with tiles, and also Shanghai plaster was damage in it, cracks, but it was still underneath the synthetic finish. This is a very thick and almost 5 or up to 8 millimeter thick layer of some sort of plastic, and then covered in latex paint. And for some time, the project, the government didn't want to restore the facade for all kind of reason, also because it's maybe a little bit more expensive or all kind of other reason, don't have to go into detail. But I argued that to have this colorful, glossy tiles next to this matte stone imitation Shanghai plaster was part of the original design intent of the architect when he designed the facades of this building. So there was a play between this yellow and the blue with the yellow dots and the black and the white Shanghai plaster next to these colorful surfaces. So I argue that this is important for the design of this building, for the facade of this building. And since the finishes are still there, and they are not that hard to restore. It's not a Ming Dynasty polychrome wall painting where you need a conservator for every 10 square centimeter. Every contractor in Hong Kong can glue back tiles to a facade, I would argue. So we actually achieved successfully with Docomomo and E-Commerce International to convince the government and the project managing to restore the original finishes. And there's a not so different example in terms of materials from Switzerland. This was a very similar plastic finish on top of an original oil paint. So this, what you see here, is not marble. It's painted marble with oil paint. And this is a combination of preservation of these areas that are still intact, restoration, filling in those little holes, and reconstruction. Some parts were not existing anymore. To go back to the original finish, which played a big role in the design of this interior. So the decision was made to restore it, because the design of the room in this case and the design of the facade in that case has a meaning for the interior or for the facade of the building. Here are two examples to look on different levels on authenticity. These are two temples with decorated wood and decorated painted wood. This temple is from, I think, 12th or 13th century, and this temple is from also around 13th, 14th century. The finishes that you see in those pictures are not. These are quite modern finishes. In this case, in China, for this temple, there was no constant maintenance or repainting done. In Korea, the Danchung painting traditionally gets repainted to maintain the surfaces. And in some cases, we want to promote that, because with that, we can also preserve the authenticity of the tradition to keep up craftsmanship, to repaint. So it's not always about only keeping all the historic materials. It can also be about keeping up the tradition of repainting. But, and I wrote this in red because it's super important, the process of repainting cannot compromise the heritage values. And that is a big problem in Korea. They don't use the traditional materials anymore. So these materials don't work. This is an acrylic finish, and it doesn't work the same way than the original finish with the movement of the wood with thermal expansion. So on the one hand, they don't work that well. They deteriorate faster. On the other hand, the traditional materials, the knowledge about what kind of pigments are used historically, what kind of painting techniques are used historically, is also lost. So right now, the university in Buyo for cultural heritage conservation has a big research project on traditional Korean paint materials to work against this problem. So back to here, you see it's possible that this was repainted at one point. For me, this finish looks a little bit too bright to be from 12th or 13th century, but a lot of these finishes are still old and not repainted periodically, like in the example below. I usually talk around the topic of my slides, and you have time to read a little bit what it's sort of like a headline for what I talk about while I explain to you why I put these pictures with these texts. This is very important because it's red. I told you that I talk about blue house again. I did the paint analysis for blue and gray house. For those of you who haven't seen the buildings before, this is gray house. It was gray like this, and blue house was blue since 1997, when the building was bought by the government, and the water service department had some paint left, and the government had to sort of maintain the building. So they used that leftover paint and painted the building blue. And this is not very common. Shop houses that have bright blue facades. So people in the area started to call it the blue house. Let's meet at the blue house. And then a whole meaning for Wanchai area was created, that blue house was a brand name. So when I found out with paint analysis that blue house was originally yellow, blue house was built in 1920. The James Settlement, who commissioned AC Lab, was a little bit nervous, like, oh, does it mean that we have to paint it yellow now? And I said, I don't really care, as long as you use materials that don't risk that the structure underneath deteriorates further. Because right now, there was a cement slurry, not only at Greyhound House, but also underneath the blue paint applied in 1997. So I told them the most important thing is we remove the cement slurry from that brick wall with lime mortar, because if you apply a cement slurry or a latex paint on top of a porous wall, like a brick wall with lime mortar and lime plaster, humidity is trapped behind these finishes. They are not water vapor and humidity open. They don't have open pores. So cement, when you apply it on a facade, you cannot prevent it from cracking because there's a thermal difference between daylight, sun shining on it, and at night, even though Hong Kong doesn't get so cold between day and night, but there's thermal expansion in material. You get fine little cracks. Rainwater can get behind a cement slurry, and then it cannot evaporate. It cannot get away. So if you went to Blue House, to the rooms in, when did I do this? I think in 2013 or 14, I was shocked that somebody was living in the room. There was black mold all over the room, which is extremely dangerous for people to breathe in the spores of mold. So the room was extremely humid. The brick wall underneath, I could sort of put my finger inside the brick. That's how wet and deteriorated it was. So I told them, you can paint the house blue again, but please don't use latex paint and cement plaster, but use lime plaster and a mineral paint finish, which is compatible with the original structure of the building. So they repainted it blue, which I was fine with. What I find a personal opinion to this facade, I don't think that the window frames and the wall finishes should be the same color and painted with the same paint. Because I think nowhere in architecture history you have a blue wall with blue, or even a brown wall and brown. Yeah, there's always a difference between joinery and plaster, I would argue. So I find that a little bit a strange decision, and I did not tell them that originally the windows were blue. So first we can discuss about that later. Another example why you should not use cement finishes or latex finishes. You see here a beautiful example from Happy Valley, what happens when you use latex finish. This is a root of a banyan tree. The banyan tree stands somewhere up there, and the root is growing underneath the finish down the facade. And when you take away the finish on another location, you see mold growing here, and underneath there's a lime finish and lime plaster. So this is a cross-section. I explained to you a couple of slides later for those who never saw that. This is a microscopic section of the surface. This whole thing is maybe 3, 4, 5 millimeter. This is the lime plaster. This is the yellow lime finishes. And that dense white thing up there is the latex finish that covers everything. So the study of traditional materials and techniques is important to identify and design suitable and compatible conservation materials. So this, all the red stuff is super important. Now, with that introduction, which I hope everybody could follow, if not, we can go back to these slides because I think these topics are a little bit more heavy. These are terms and professional ethics, things that are really close to me because it's my profession, and so sometimes maybe it's a little bit harder to follow me because I have so much background information. It gets a little bit easier now with the case study and basically going through the process of what did I do to investigate the finishes on this site. You see an image here. This is actually from 2012. You still see the old finishes here. And to remind everybody in general, what should any paint finish investigation include? When you see what sometimes people have to work with when they said, oh, can you investigate my building? What a lot of people in the field are afraid of, that they don't understand. Like I was told, don't be too technical. People are afraid of technical reports. People cannot read chemical formulas. So it's important to write a report that is on the one hand technical correct. So everybody from science can also look at it and say, yes, this is correct, and thus I can follow up what you did with your analysis. But you also have to help a building project manager and a design architect to understand these results. So the paint finish analysis has to have a clear objective. I have to know what I do so that I know how I do it. The research question has to be defined well. Historical research has to be done. The more I know about the building, the better I can investigate the materials. And that goes together sort of with the understanding of the building and the restoration project. What is the idea? Do we deal with the historic ruin and we want to keep it like a ruin, we only want to preserve it? Or do we want to reuse the building? What is the result? And what do I have to work to with my investigation? In situ investigation, to go on the site, to take the samples, taking the sample part is super important. I don't like to have somebody giving me samples, because if I don't know where the sample is coming from, I can make a lot of mistakes in interpreting. So it is very important to have one person going to the site and taking the sample, who then also looks at the sample in the laboratory, or at least one team. Then the laboratory analysis. I talk about one specific type that I mostly used to investigate finishes in Central Police Station. And I have only one slide with a lot of scientific terms to remind you that you can go much further in detail with investigation. We actually didn't have to do this for the purpose of the investigation of this site, because of the level of information required from the result of this investigation. And then, of course, there has to be a written report, because somehow you have to communicate this to the client, the project team, the architect. I am using in the next few slides a lot of times the word cross-section. I mentioned it before quickly. This is a cross-section through paint finishes, and with S, again, I call substrate. In this case, it's wood. This is a sample actually from Bohemia House. So this is the window frame of Bohemia House. Maybe if you came from that side, then you walked through the building. It's now, part of it is open. So this is where the wood was. The wood is not existing because I scratched it off the wood. And then there are the historic finishes. There's sort of a rule in painting research that we always present finishes with the oldest or the substrate at the bottom and then going up. So this would be the finish that I saw when I took the sample. The window frame was blue when I took the sample, and this is the sequence of finishes that was painted on this window frame. You have to be reminded when we look at these building parts, we don't always have this beautiful finish sequence like in this case, because a lot of time building parts are stripped from paint before they are repainting. So in this case, or in Central Police Station case, we were quite lucky, I think, mostly because it was a government site. It was a police station and prison, so there was always maintenance of the buildings, and there's a really beautiful sequence of paint finishes. Now, I have a couple of phrases or of boxes here. I talk about the objective before, the objective for the paint analysis. So what question has to be answered by the analysis? Do I want to know only what the original color of the building was? Or do I want to know exactly what green pigment was used somewhere there, maybe in the 1960s to 20s? Or do I want to know what technique was used in this or in this or in this finish? So if the conservation architect or whoever commissions me knows exactly how much information they know, this is my favorite situation. In this project, I told the interview team earlier that this was a very rare case for Hong Kong. Brian, who's in the audience, commissioned AC Lab for this job, and he knew exactly what he wants from this analysis. A lot of time now I get requests to, can you paint analysis my building? And the project manager does not always really know what they do with the results later, because the government tells them by specification you have to do paint analysis, but they don't really know why and how to use the information. In the case of Taekwon, Brian's office was very familiar with why paint analysis is done, so this is how I knew it from Europe. And then later I realized that in Asia, a lot of time I have to educate the client a little bit more. This is what I can tell you. This is how much it is if I tell you only by cross-section. This is how much it is if I only also use further scientific investigation methods. So depending on how much the level of detail of the information that is important, that is sought, and then is it qualitative or quantitative? It's a little bit more for plaster. So do I want to restore a plaster with the same mixture like originally? Then I have to know, is there cement in it, yes or no? That would be qualitative. Or how much lime and how much sand is in there? That would be quantitative. If I have to do each of these, this one is very quick. You can do it with one press on a scientific instrument. This one takes a little bit longer. You have to separate binder and sand. So all these questions sort of influence the objective and the work that is done and the price for the analysis. It also costs something. This about allows then for the project objective directly for this project was the documentation of the decorative history of the buildings and for establishing the basis for the restoration planning for the new finishes. So at a site like the Central Former Temple Police Station or Taekwon, you have buildings between 1858 and 1950, I think, when I arrived at the site. So obviously there's already a different finishes history between these buildings. If you would actually paint every single building in the original paint of it, in the original 1903, original 1921, you sort of tear apart the site. So that for Brian, it was, for Purcell, it was really important to know what is the decorative history of all the buildings. How did the building look originally? But then also, how did this building look at 1930 when the majority of the other buildings around it were built? Because most probably at that moment, the 1904 building was painted again to fit with the other buildings. So that's why not only the original finish, but also the sequence, the layering, the history, decorative history of the buildings is important. And then, yeah, for making these decisions. This was basically the objective. So that's what I mean with the depths of analysis or the level of detail that's sought. Here, we didn't need to look into the pigments that were used, that for the context of this project was not part of the investigation. We investigated 15 historic buildings on the site. We took, well, we didn't really take 450 samples, but we looked at 450 sample sites. I think we only took 420 something because some locations were just, there was nothing to be sampled, so I just told there's nothing there anymore, or it doesn't make sense to make a cross-section here, but reported 450 sample areas and prepared a report. This is a couple of impressions of how you don't remember it anymore. Maybe some of you went to the site before it was restored. These 450 sample areas were determined by a British conservator who did a first investigation in 2011, and she took first 48 samples and then gave suggestions of why and how many further samples should be taken to understand the buildings better. So we were able to work with this information that she gave us, and this was also used to a quote that was a part of the brief to quote for this project. And we then, here it's written, we took 458. No, the tender documents include 458. I think we took 420 or something. And then most of the samples were taken in May and June 2012. Now I go step by step to the process that I went through, or that you should go through, or everybody should go through for investigation of architectural finishes. So the first step is to know as much as possible about the building that you investigate, or the building part that you investigate. And I did not have to do all this work. This is a very big project. A lot of teams and offices were involved. And the work of going to the records office to look at old newspapers, to look at structures and find out what was built earlier or later was done by a different office, and they provided me with a very large A3 report of every single building, where I got information like when the building was built, that their story was added later, which is extremely helpful if I have to make a decision where to take a sample on a building like this. Here, this is the old one, 1, 2, 3, and a gable, and then here 1, 2, 3, 4. That the gable disappeared, and another story was added in 1906. So with this information, if I have to give an information about what was the facade finish originally of the facade towards the parade ground of the barracks block, then I have this information that this story was added in 1906. Obviously, I have to take the samples somewhere here to find that out. So very important to know as much as possible. And this is how the report presented that. Here you see different colors were used for different building parts, so very, very detailed for us to go through the site, to take this as a sort of like guideline for us to look for the best sample locations. Then taking the actual sample, the one thing is, after I make a decision in terms of building time of building part, where to take the sample, I also have to look for the condition. In the buildings, they were decommissioned in 2006, and when I first went to the site in 2012, I was just basically coming fresh from Switzerland, where I did this work a lot, and my impression was that this site has to be decommissioned for 20 years, because the weather in Hong Kong is so harsh to buildings. Even though there's frost and thaw circles in Switzerland, I never saw something molding and delaminating so quickly in these few years like in Hong Kong. So the humid climate is very harsh to porous building materials. So the one thing is find a location that is not in this condition. You see algae growing underneath the finishes, or rusting paint. It was not so easy to actually find paint finishes on the ironwork. Then it was not always easy to access. So maybe I want to take the sample here, but then Danny here built that little balcony for me in a different location. It's really, really hard to take samples in Hong Kong. Everything is about safety. I have to wear the helmet all the time and the vest, and I can only go where they tell me to, because there has to be a safe access. So that makes it sometimes hard for me to professionally take a sample where I want to take it. And then I have to record very well where I take the sample. I did with these cards that I printed. I made up this system for this site because I knew I have 450 samples. So I have 450 little plastic bags with sample materials later in the lab, and I have to know exactly where it's coming from. So I printed these little cards where I put the building part and the building number that was given to the buildings already in the brief, to be able to later relate my result to the sample location. So collecting the samples according to the historic information in a building part that is not deteriorating, and not forgetting where we took the sample is important steps in taking the samples. We took samples of almost all the facade and interior of the sort of historically meaningful buildings on the site. Then it gets technical. We take the sample out of the plastic bag in the laboratory and put it under a stereo microscope. There's a nicer picture on the next slide of the stereo microscope. First, of the unprepared sample, to just look at the photos again. Where did I take the sample? Why did I take the sample? And then selecting a representative part of this finish to show what I saw. A lot of time, the cross-section for me is sort of a proof of what I saw in the investigation, and then also a different level of information. Sometimes I already found out through excavation on the site what I can see there, but then I need the cross-section to communicate that in the report and to show it in layers. So I select a representative part of the sample, and I have this little silicone block here. And 50% of the resin is already poured in there 8 hours earlier. Then I place the sample on top, fill it up with epoxy resin again. Epoxy resin, you probably know from collecting butterflies. It's a sort of a glassy substance that you can polish shiny. And then the sample is placed in, like here, with the layer sort of orthogonal to the block, and then it is polished from one side. So you have a cross-section that you can look at with the microscope. You see me here looking at a sample, and this is the microscope image of one of those little samples. This is how they look in my hand. So this is about the size of these little samples that I take from the buildings. Obviously, a mortar sample is a little bit bigger because we want to see a little bit more material. These are paint finish samples. They are then polished. This is a polishing machine. The surface has to be super shiny because if you look at something with a microscope, which you probably know, it gets magnified, and then you also see scratches, and you don't have a very big depth of focus. So the surface has to be even and shiny to look at, to get this cross-section that you saw in earlier images, and that you see here. With this, I come back to the example from a little bit earlier, that barracks block with the top floor where I just take the sample. I just take this sample. This is the cross-section of the facade finish of the 3rd floor, and this is the cross-section of the facade finish of the 2nd floor. And I see here that this mortar, not a mortar, it's a plaster, lime plaster, is not the same than this. This is the one from 1906, and this is the one from 1862. And with this comparison of these two finishes, and with this beautiful layering that we have existing here, we can exactly date this yellow, pale yellow finish, yellowish, whitish, creamy finish to 1906. Now, that is a point that is quite important when I say yellowish, whitey, creamy. You can actually it's very hard to take a color matching from a cross-section, because the color of a finish changes because of the reflective index when you embed it into resin. So you know this from example, if you have a little bit of flour on the table, and it's white, and when you pour a little bit water on it, it gets kind of beige gray. The same happens when you have a lime finish with a little bit of yellow in it. If it's impregnated with resin, it looks a little bit different. So if you really want to color match a finish like this, you have to go back to the site and make a little opening excavate, and then you can go there with a color code card. You know that if you're in a design profession, there are these color code cards with numbers for different colors that you can communicate colors with a client or with a colleague. Because computer screens prints always produce different colors, so you cannot really print out and say this yellow, I want this yellow on my building, because the architect may print it out with a different printer and paint something totally different. That's why these color codes are existing and used to discuss colors. So only by observation of this cross-section, you can already see quite a lot of information. For example, the substrate and its preparation. In this case, this is a cross-section of a wood. You see the ear rings here, and you see there's some sort of preparation here that is an orange finish. This is most probably a lead-containing finish that also protects the wood from decay. I know that because I have experience in looking at cross-section, and I also have experience, or I studied painting techniques and historic painting techniques. Obviously, you cannot identify that. If you want to really identify this, then you have to go further, do elemental analysis, molecule analysis, to really prove that this is true. If you look at in comparison with known samples, then sometimes you can already do this only by optical observation. You can see adhesion, although here most of this, I know this also from experience, this is only from preparation. So these finishes were fine, but if you take a little sample out of a big window frame, it's not always easy to have a full package of finishes in the preparation. You can investigate painting and decoration techniques, but also here it's much easier to do this with excavation, which is often a follow-up exercise after the cross-section today or in Hong Kong. You can have first indication on materials. Actually, I think the nicest example was the earlier one where you saw the lime finishes and then the latex finish on top, a very clear difference between material. Even though you didn't identify material, you clearly see a difference between historic and modern material. So the rough dating or the even exact dating is the last point that I put, that you can do only by investigating cross-section. Obviously, with different level of expertise or experience, you see a little bit more. And I put these two boxes back that I showed you earlier. What question has to be answered by the analysis? If you want to know more, you can go a little bit further. This is an example of that temple in Yunnan that I showed earlier with a red finish on the wooden beams. This is the stereo microscope cross-section, and I put the materials here, wood, ground layer, and oil paint. And then the same behind me here. In the scanning electron microscope image with backscattered electrons. That sounds super complicated. This is basically an elemental analysis of different points in this ground layer. We wanted to find out what the ground layer is made of. A lot of times that is made of lime, sometimes it's made of clay, sometimes it's made of another sort of oil mix with pigment. So in this case, it was made of gypsum, and you see here the explanation of what we found in the ground layer. So there's also kaolin in there, which we found in the FTIR, which we did from the same sample. FTIR is Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. Also sounds super complicated, also not going to explain all that tonight. It's further scientific investigation method to look at binding media, to look at inorganic or organic material, to identify them by looking at elements or looking at how elements are connected in a molecule to identify a material. another step which I mentioned before already is that after we take the cross-section, or ideally before, I actually think it would be always better to do it first, but it's quite time-consuming. So it's much faster to quickly go to the site to take 10 samples of the finish rather than going there and excavating 10 square centimeter in 10 locations. So that's why now cross-section is usually preferred. And then, if necessary, for color matching or for looking at a decorative painting, this is a building part in a building in Switzerland where they did wood graining, so imitation of wood on wood that is done to imitate a more valuable wood. So this is a pine wood panel that was painted to be an oak panel. And you don't see that in the cross-section so easily. In the cross-section, that is a white oil layer, and then a super thin brown oil layer that sort of looks like dirt, and then the green layers on top. So this is much easier to see, to excavate this layer by layer. This is an area that we found in one of, I think it was a smoking room in the deputy superintendent's house, a dado line. So you have to imagine that in this area, around maybe 1 meter 10 or something, there was a dado line along the room with these decorations. This is a stenciling. Stenciling means that there's a pattern that is repeated, that is either a piece of cardboard where this pattern is cut out and you paint over it, or it can be a roll that is rolled over the wall and then has a repetitive pattern. So I did this little opening actually only because I get very excited when I find something like this and to show it, but we didn't do further investigation of this in the context of the 450 sample analysis, which was already quite a lot of work. Then the step 6 is to prepare the report. To support my interpretation, I repeated some of the information that I got served by the previous report on the historic documentation of the buildings. And then I summarized the information of what I found in every building. Then what I did on the site before to note where I took the samples is cleaned up for the report. And then these parts maybe only some assistants have to read through every single sample, or one sample is especially interesting, so you go to that page. But all the information from every single 400 and something sample is summarized with the building. So to easier understand how those results relate to the entire building. And here is one example of I think, most significant finding, or what was most important for the conservation or the restoration decision later. When the site was decommissioned, there was a lot of blue on joinery, on wood and metal parts. And this blue was sort of in the memory of people in Hong Kong at the time. They felt it belongs to the site. But with the investigation of the finishes, do you see that these blue finishes came quite late? Obviously, it's easier to remember something from the 80s than remember something from the 1920s. So we could prove scientifically, basically, that the police blue on the site is a later addition. There were a couple of green and blue finishes that were already from the 30s, but it was really about those bright blues that you saw also in the first images that was called the police blue. And originally, most of these joinery and metal parts were actually painted in serviceable colors like brown and black. And most of the building finishes were in cream or white color. That was sort of the majority of the finishes in the early time of the buildings. And here's a before and after between 2012 and 2018 of the facade towards Hollywood Road, which you see when you come up the escalator and cross the new bridge. And then here is another before and after of the D hall, which I took a couple of days ago and before we took the samples. And then here is actually because this is fair-faced brick, and it was and is fair-faced brick, but you see in detail also here we had the blue and here, and this is now returned to like brown or black finishes. There's a couple of things that we investigated separately later, and I added this here because it's also about finishes, but a little bit different topic. You may saw this already, and I just talked with Claudia about it. I think at one point there should be interpretation of this, and it's not finished yet. So there's this passageway which was opened. It was originally open and was closed at one point. And during the demolition work to reopen this passage, this decoration was found. The archway was blocked in the 1920s, or it's assumed that that is from the same report that I talked about earlier. And this decoration was found, which sort of looks like a church, because we have these crosses here, and we have a window. Is it here? Yeah, a window with this like typical shape, what you would expect in a little chapel. We have two different decoration in the bottom, the colorful one, and at the top this painted masonry. It was in quite bad condition, so there was a lot of tension. This is a thick, almost 3 millimeter thick layer of finishes that came off the wall. But the surface of the lower part here directly on, there's a cement plaster underneath, so it can't be that old, was in quite good condition. We found actually this picture was in the report sorted in a different building because it was not really clear where this was. But then we compared the space after that decoration was found. This is sort of, you see the same corner of the room, and you actually see a little bit here those round metal things from that grill over the door. So they used this space as a prison chapel, and they closed up the back, and there was the altar, and they used this window behind. In this image is from 1969, where you already don't see the decoration that you just saw. That's how we sort of dated that these finishes have to be between 1920 and 1969. So they're not super old, but they're still quite special, I think, for Hong Kong, because in Hong Kong we don't have that many polychrome decorated finishes in this public buildings with these kind of styles. So I still find it's kind of interesting, even though it's artistically or from the way it's painted, it's not super special. It's not super artistically valuable, but it's a very interesting decoration. And I also investigated the sequence of the finishes in the area. This is the base, which is a little bit higher than the top with the masonry blocks. So first, the base was painted, and then at one point later, the masonry was added. So the two finishes did not always stand together. This, if you saw it now, if you walk through, it was now preserved as is, which I find a little bit strange, because a lot of these holes were actually done because the contractor who excavated this was not professional. So a lot of this damage was done through during the excavation. And from my professional opinion, you should close everything that you did in 2012. so that it's easier to read what was there before, and it's okay to leave something that was already broken or already missing, but for a simple decoration like this, where it's very easy and very repetitive, I would restore all the areas that was demolished in 2012, but this is also an interpretation or a discussion how to preserve a certain area. This about the decoration, and this is already the conclusion. I have no idea how long I took until now, where I want to sort of remind you again what can be gained from a paint finish investigation. And a lot of these bullet points were discussed in the last slides. Is it about a significant historic period, or can we even date a certain period? Is it about original materials or original techniques? Is it information on historic painting or identification of historic painting techniques that we don't want to lose? Is it to guide the conservation architect in the removal or in the repainting process? Or is this about the condition and how to deal with these building parts in future? Because if you restore something, it will also be exposed to weathering again. So everything that is restored is also continuously exposed to deterioration and weathering, the old and the new materials together. And here, my final sentence: only a holistic understanding of the existing heritage resource can result in a compatible and sustainable conservation intervention with due consideration of all its heritage values. And with this, I'm closing. And I'm really happy if you want to ask questions. I can go back to single images or explain certain aspects of what I said. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gesa, for tonight's talk. As said, is there any questions? We open up a question on the floor. The first, yes, please go on.
I have two rather lengthy questions, and I apologize in advance if they sound really ignorant. So you said that in the beginning that it's important to honor the original finishing that the building was done in, but with the Tycoon project, you also mentioned that because the buildings were sort of built in varying timelines and they all had to look really coherent, how did you sort of balance that? That's the first question. And the second question is the timing of sample collection important? For example, is it winter, summer, day, night, or where the sample is? Like, does it face the sun rising, sun setting, etc.? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your question. The first question, actually, that in this project was not me to decide. I did the investigation and I submitted the report, and that was Brian's job to look at, to interpret our results and to make the decisions to bring the buildings, to present the building together in 2018 when it was open, to 17. Yeah, that's the further question. Yeah, maybe afterwards you have time to talk to Brian about this process. And the second question, it is not really important at what time in Hong Kong. It's nicer to take the samples in winter because it's not hot and humid and sticky and mosquito-y on sites. But it doesn't really matter for paint finish analysis. Obviously, you look for protected areas anyway, so in the middle of a sunny facade, you don't find that much information, so maybe you go around the corner where less weathering is. But no, there's not really a big difference. Yeah, you have to introduce yourself now.
Indeed. Well, I couldn't get out of this one, could I? Thank you very much for the question. It's a very pertinent question. The view that we took about which colour scheme to restore each of the elements to was driven by two things. The first one was that we wanted to ensure that the colour scheme for the wall or the joinery, for example, was consistent with the way that element was first built. So, for example, Gesa mentioned that quite a lot of the window frames, external door frames, were painted blue. And there was a lot of talk at the time about our decision to repaint them brown. A lot of people spoke to me about the importance of collective memory, and that the replacement of blue elements with brown ones went against the grain, so to speak. But the view I took was that when we think about collective memory, we have to think about whose collective memory. Because if you're your sort of age, you will always remember the blue. If you're my sort of age, you probably wouldn't remember the brown, but you'd certainly have remembered a scheme before the blue. So when you think about collective memory, you do need to think about other factors and not rely on that consideration alone. So, for example, with those window frames, because we were unpicking the brutal interventions of the modern past when condenser units were installed to provide air conditioning, we were unpicking all of that and putting in a new air conditioning system. And we were restoring those window frames physically to the way they were originally. And it seemed to us that that configuration of those frames should go with the colour that they were first coated with, so that you had a match between the arrangement of the item and the colour of it. Okay, so that was one consideration. The second one was to do with, and Gesa touched on this, the different dates that the various buildings were built of. And as Gesa said, the earliest buildings are 1840s, the latest buildings were over a century later. And what we discovered was that if you took all of the information obtained from Gesa's work, you had a multiplicity of original colours. And we took the view that we should not replicate those colours slavishly, that we felt that we should aggregate them to a degree so that you had some sense of the variety of colours. So, for example, D Hall, the big cell block adjacent to this building, that's painted white. The barracks block is painted a yellowy off-white. So there are differences. Some of them are as accurate as we can make them. Others are interpretation. So you get a blend of colours without, we think, the incoherence that would arise if you slavishly replicated all the colours. And you know, when you think that some elements of the colour schemes were a sort of star-ferry green, black, brown, blue, turquoise, bright yellow, there was even some orange here and there. If you were to slavishly reproduce those colours, you'd end up with a really peculiar outcome. So we took the view that we wanted to understand what the original colours were relevant to the thing that we were conserving, wall, door frame, whatever, but also to provide an overall coherent scheme. Whilst I've got the microphone, perhaps I could just draw attention to one element that touches on something that Gesa talked about with regard to the blue house. This example also relates to blue. Many of you will know the Blue Gate on Old Bailey Street. And if you know the site now, you will know that it's painted green, but we still call it the Blue Gate. It's painted green because originally that was the colour of it. And when our client, the Jockey Club, said, well, okay, so what colour do we repaint it then? Following the logic that I've just described, I said, well, you have to repaint it green. The response was, well, we can't do that possibly because everyone knows it as the Blue Gate. And I said, well, that's absolutely fine. Maybe it's my quirky British humour, but the idea of having an object painted green that's called the Blue Gate is something that I think is a little bit of fun, slightly mischievous. But what it also does is it gets people asking the question, how can this be? And the asking of the question is a very neat trigger to then explain why the Blue Gate is so important. That's not for now, that story, that's for another time. But it's an example of where you could use your knowledge gained from Gesa's work that feeds directly back into the interpretation of the site. Lastly, I have got a question for Gesa. You spoke, Gesa, early on about the 450-odd samples that you were asked to do. And in our experience, having done this kind of work a number of times, we know how problematic it is when you're briefing someone such as yourself, because there's always this tension between obtaining tenders for doing this work. Most clients will want competitive tenders. Question, well, how many samples? Because the number of samples must have some relation to the cost. So what's your view about how this kind of work ought to be procured? Do you have any kind of, just in case there are any potential clients in the audience, how you would advise them to go about tendering for this sort of work?
In this case, the preparation work was done, in my eyes, professionally. So I felt that the number of samples that Lisa Österreicher suggested made sense for me for those buildings. Well, I had, in the case of the project I did last year or the year before, a school building in Happy Valley, I had the problem that the client did not want to take so many samples because there was not so much money available. But then at one point I have to say, then I cannot give you information of the facade. So either I take 20 samples and I can give you a good result, or I can, like, how can I say, I can be sure that what I ever say about the finish is true, or I take only 2 samples, but then I can only give you an indication. I can say it's most probably, but so there's a certain number of samples that I need to write in a report that this finish was originally yellow. And that's why there's, with clients in Hong Kong, and that's also what I mentioned before, that if the client doesn't really know what they can gain from the paint analysis, they often also don't know how to count them, or then they just want as few as possible so that it's not so expensive. And then I discuss with them. It depends on how much information you want and how sure you want to be.
Thank you, Gesa. Any more questions at the back, maybe? Gentlemen?
For many clients, especially commercial clients, they will consider practicality and easy maintenance more than the heritage value of the building fabric. In this case, if there is a modern paint finish which is compatible with the building material and require less maintenance, would you consider it acceptable to use modern material rather than the original type of finish?
You said modern material, but then you also said compatible material. So a lot of time for historic building, modern material are not compatible. They are modern materials that are compatible. This is the most important thing. That is what I mentioned about the Blue House, that for me it was not really important which color the St. James Settlements wants to repaint the building, as long as they don't use a color that is incompatible with the original fabric.
But what if the modern material is actually compatible with the building material? Say, if there is...
Give me an example.
Right, I'm not expert in it. For example, say powder coating on metal finish. and we know it's long-lasting.
Sorry, I acoustically didn't get.
Powder coating on metal finish, we know it's long-lasting, hardware. It probably will last better than original type of paint on the metal. Would you consider something like this to be acceptable?
It is acceptable if the more important thing is to preserve the metal element rather than having a historical, artistic, or whatever value of that specific finish that is on that metal part. So that is how I make the decision.
So you mentioned the contractor worker working on the excavation. What was the point of doing the excavation while producing damages to the heritage? Was it part of the project to do the excavation? What was the point?
I actually don't know why it was excavated so quickly. When I first saw it, it was already excavated, and it was done too fast with two big tools. So there was a lot of harm done to the surface that you could see like directly after. Now it's already dusty, but at that moment you could see that this was freshly scraped into the surface.
You also
and this
mentioned...
this is done by a contractor and who didn't know better. It's not really the contractor's fault. So somebody should have stopped them after the first square meter.
You talk about a compatibility issue between the modern material and the historic ones. So does it mean that this project you're trying best to recover by using the historic materials rather than the modern materials so that you can have a more compatible output?
In this project for restoration of the wall finishes, mineral finishes were used, which are compatible with the porous building materials, and a lot of latex finishes were removed. Actually, a part of the buildings looked very similar to that example with the banyan tree. I think we even had also banyan roots somewhere at the bottom here. So incompatible finishes were removed and mineral finishes were applied.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.